So what I'm going to do this evening is just have a few short remarks to introduce the dinner, and then I'm going to make a small presentation to Leo Goldschmidt, who retired from the board during the year. And as I will repeat later on, we miss him very much already, but we do want to mark his retirement from the board. I'd like very much also to thank David Frick from Nestle. He's here, and David is going to talk to us later on. He's come back early from the United States in order to be here this evening, so I look forward to what you have to say, being responsible for corporate governance in such a very large and prestigious company. So that will be very interesting. Marco Becht will introduce him and deal with that side of things. I also want to thank Didier Cousin, who is over there, and the reason for that is that Didier is the leader in IMD who has animated our ability to use the facilities. First of all, for a board meeting that we had this afternoon, which is an interesting board meeting. He took several decisions essentially around implementation of our development plan, which you'll hear about tomorrow and in due course fairly shortly receive a copy of it. It's also where we're going to have our AGM and our guest lecture tomorrow. And please remember, here's the first of many reminders if Marco does his job, that kick-off is at 8:30 to have coffee and meet each other. It's not just to turn up and put through the formal resolutions. I put a good deal of value on being able to talk to each other. So 8:30 tomorrow morning. Now, I also want to mention two other individuals who are here. So, excuse me, Nirmal Mohanty is here, just here at the top table. He is the chief economist of the Indian Stock Exchange, which is an important stock exchange, as you can imagine. And he has come specially from Mumbai to be here and to meet as many of you as possible. So in the social side of this meeting, both this evening and tomorrow, I want you to do what you can to talk to him, and I'll explain in my own words, not his, what he's here about. Under the fairly recent Companies Act in India, which is a big piece of legislation, by the way, which I happen to have something to do with before I retired, the stock exchange has become responsible for corporate governance in a kind of regulatory capacity, including this very thorny question of enforcement responsibilities. I'm aware that the Spanish financial regulator or stock exchange regulator is in charge of that as well, and I've always wondered how you do that with a slippery subject such as corporate governance. In any event, Nirmal has a plan that training would be helpful for Indian board members, and in particular not so much training by either Indians from within India or the Indian diaspora, but he would like also people like us to make our contribution, that is either from academia or from the practice side. So again, that's just a perspective I want to give you, and you're very welcome, and thank you for coming. So all of you do your bit to make sure his trip is worthwhile and make your connections, and we certainly in ECGI are keen to explore. It is financially and in terms of time demanding to see if we could do by way of things like round tables, which you'll hear about tomorrow, but we have some possibilities in mind. It will take some work and some money to get them to be realised should the ideas we have suit Nirmal and his colleagues. Now, the second person I want to mention is the man in the beard right in front of me, and that is Guy Jubb, whom I have known for a long time, but the beard is a recent addition. So this is a sign of retirement, ladies and gentlemen. And we're very lucky to have him because we have selected from quite a strong field of potential candidates for the board. We have selected Guy, and he has very kindly agreed to go forward for appointment tomorrow as a director and member of the board of ECGI. Why is he important? Well, first of all, I happen to know that for the last 20 years he has been nothing but helpful and constructive and deeply thoughtful about the issues that arise. He's a very consistent man in how he handles it, and he brings, or I hope he will bring to the board, a quite different perspective. We have obviously a strong academic content, we have me as an accountant for what that's worth, and we have some what you might call practitioners of the dark arts of corporate governance in practice. So to have somebody who comes from the institutional shareholder side, who has had long experience of dealing with big, difficult corporate events and decisions, for example, executive pay, is going to bring something very different to our board. So Guy, I'm most grateful to you for coming, and it's a sign of his quality that On his retirement, the very prestigious University of Edinburgh has made him an adjunct professor. So you are hereby instructed to call him Professor Job if you want to be nice to him. Now, I did thank you all at the beginning, but I also want to mention that amongst the people here are not only ECGI members, but some people from IMD, from the staff and so on, which is super. We like to see some other talent as well. And I think we have a couple of PhD students, and that's also very good. So I think all of that is just what we want. And lastly, I just want to mention that although they're not represented directly here tonight, our foundation members, our patron members who fund on a very generous scale the Research Foundation, both Investor and BP have been extremely strong supporters, and we really have our plans are bigger than our shoes, if I may put it that way. We need bigger shoes, we need more resources to do this job better, mainly for the academics who will then produce better stuff and disseminate it more, and we'll get more engagement with practitioners and with regulators. So I think if we believe in academic research and its value, there's a big opportunity here to take things on another step, building on Leo's legacy, and anything you can do to help us build institutional capacity in terms of membership and particularly patrons would be very welcome. So that's the introductory bit, and I just want now to deal with the main dish of the day, viz. Leo Goldschmidt. And it's a great privilege to me as a comparatively recent addition to the ECGI clan to have this chance to say what I at least have learned about him. I won't be able to say very much because it would take all night to recount all his extraordinary career and personality, but I think the very first thing I would say, and you've got to think of me coming in having known ECGI as what I might call an enthusiastic attender of conferences, but not anything to do with the board. Suddenly you're chairman of it, which is quite a surprise. But anyway, you come to this board meeting and you have an obviously wise gentleman. And what do you make of him? Well, the very first thing that strikes you is that he's interesting. And not interesting because he smiles or speaks, but because he has a huge range of interests. So if you take his cultural interests like opera, or you think about his linguistic skills and his urbanity and suave manner, no doubt in several languages. And I mention the languages because one of his tasks was to persuade the Belgian authorities to give us a certain tax status. And I have preserved my copy of these exquisite letters in French to Chère Madame. And I mean, the flowery language it's like a sort of an exquisite lesson in how to write an important letter in the most exquisitely polite terms. It's fantastic. And it's just one of your many attributes that you are such a good linguist, and secondly, such a courteous and cheerful man. I think also we could mention that you're also interesting because you're so interested in people and in ideas, and that ideas we'll come back to, but we're lucky that corporate governance caught your attention. Now, things are not always easy with Leo. You have to understand that. He's a difficult man because he has a sort of understated rigor about him. Now he never shows that really very obviously, but if you're, for example, trying to play with the Articles of Association and there is some unhappy clause that his attention is fastened on, there's not much point having a long discussion about it, because if he thinks it's wrong, he will politely stick to his guns, and there's the sort of easy, understated rigor. He just is determined to get his things done the way he thinks right, and it would take a great deal to persuade you that he's wrong. And on larger questions, the more strategic and larger questions where there's more room for debate, let us say, he has a very easy style of dealing with them. All his very strong views about them are never expressed as strong views. They come across as polite suggestions to be considered. And he doesn't argue about them. They are full of weight, and they kind of carry the day without much assistance, because then, say, Daniela or myself or somebody will start saying, well, actually, that's pretty good, yeah. And after 20 minutes, suddenly, without moving a muscle, Leo's rigorous thinking has got us to where we should have been in the first place. He's usually correct. Now, in dealing with this rather formidable man, there is the art which I want to describe to you as the apparently or supposedly innocent question. he uses this sort of question trick to see if everybody else has caught up or got as far with thinking about something. So he'll ask an innocent question to which he perfectly knows the answer and you haven't thought of. It's another lovely technique. I learn as I do this job with him around. And then, of course, how do you deal with the person who has made a mistake, an embarrassing mistake? And what Leo's technique for this is if I said, the black is white, let us say, he will say, he said, I hadn't thought of that. That's most interesting. And those are fatal words if you hear them from Leo, all right? You have made some awful clangor mistake and you had better retreat at once. His way of saying, you are wrong, please think again. So here we have a man sitting quietly there listening to all this nonsense from me who has all these excellent qualities. He's a lot of style about him. He has, what could I say, a sort of mischievous look about him, twinkling eyes. And he's also, practically speaking, a lifetime of experience in boards of directors. Not much happened at the top of Belgian business that didn't involve Leo in some way for a long time. All of which means to say that he has been by far the most formidable member of our board. And indeed, as you know, I'm sure all of you have heard of, or if not read carefully, Animal Farm by George Orwell. And as you know, the animal farm, run by the animals for themselves, was run on strictly egalitarian lines, except that the pigs were actually in charge. And at one point in the book, the pigs explain, I can't remember the name of the pig as I stand here, but he explains that some animals are more equal than others. And in this case, I have to say that some directors are more equal than others in ECGI when Leo is around. And Leo, I'm afraid you were, when a director, more equal than the rest of us. You're the true father of ECGI, I believe. You certainly understand the social importance of corporate governance. And I mean by that it's not a narrow subject for businessmen to play with. I think we're beginning to see much more attention to the social dimension of companies. There's Colin Meyer's project in the UK, but it's far from alone. And if this sort of the remains of this crisis are not well handled, we'll find more about it. So that sort of social importance led Leo to, I think, was probably his particularly valuable insight, which is that if you're going to have standards of corporate governance, they had better be based on solid intellectual foundations of the highest quality. And that then gives you, if you disseminate those findings, it gives you a basis for persuading others of your point of view and of making sure that those ideas are well considered in the corridors of power, an area where you are well used to working. And essentially, I think you have really helped start ECGI from very modest beginnings, a very informal kind of group of academically driven people, to what is now here a very vibrant organization, I think potentially on the verge of another big step forward. And I'd like to thank you for all you did for making this happen over a long time. I know your strong personal commitment to scientific research. For example, Marco's professorship is funded by Leo. I have to say that I think in summary that you're, in terms of ECGI, a visionary. You're also a very charming and kind person, a very wonderful colleague on a board, and really, I suppose the best way to put it is the father of ECGI. So with that, I have failed to take up the book that I intend to present to you, which I'm going to invite you to come up, and I will go over beside Didier and collect it. But it's a book of testimonials, a small book of testimonials written in favor of Leo and all his works. It's on the table when I last saw it. And it has some nice pictures for him to look at and see if he recognizes anybody in it. So Leo, would you like to come forward? Thank you very much, Elaine. And I will present you with this mark of. Here you are.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Leo. Thank you so much for everything you did. If you would like to say something, here is the micro, and I will sit down.
Well, I'm overwhelmed. I've never heard such praise in my whole life. And I think that you have largely exaggerated what you have told this assembly. It is true that I took part in the foundation of ECGI, but I'm by no means its father. There are several fathers who are responsible for it, and this is something to be shared. And I would like to say to all of you how much I've enjoyed the process. During the drink period, just before our dinner, some of our guests said, I came to corporate governance by mere chance and so on. As far as I'm concerned, this is not the case. I came to corporate governance actually quite early, in my 20s, for a not-for-profit organization that became quite important in Belgium, and that taught me the basics of corporate governance, how a board works, how the relationship between all the stakeholders should work, and so on. And I learned by doing. Later, I was exposed to much more intensive corporate governance when I became a partner of Bank de Groof, which was a partnership bank and therefore was allowed under the quirks of Belgian law to have directorships in industrial and commercial companies which other bankers could not have in our country. And this gave me a vantage point which showed me the diversity of approaches that different boards, different companies had in the governance of their organizations. And this puzzled me. So when I retired from banking at the end of the 80s, because my health did not allow me to pursue that, I thought, what would I do with myself in the remaining years? And this intriguing question of corporate governance and its unresolved problems was something that I thought I would devote a little bit of time to. And so one of the things that I did was to devote quite a lot of time, energy and thought to what we are all about here. Now, I was fortunate at that period chairing a corporate governance committee of the defunct ECGI, which was the clone of the European would-be clone of NASDAQ, to have as a scientific advisor one Marco Becht, whose presence was mentioned to me. And this is how we got to know each other. He had his network called the European Corporate Governance Network of Academics. And because of that, we thought at one stage, we cannot go on doing this in an amateurish way, have to do this more professionally. And so we decided to create ECGI, not just the two of us, but a number of people around Marco. And so this is how it all came about. So when I said at the beginning that some people came to corporate governance by chance, as far as I'm concerned, it seems to have been a trajectory that has been more or less planned from the start. And what I'd like to say in parting is that I've enjoyed it tremendously. One of the greatest things that I think I took away myself, and I'm very grateful to ECGI for it, is the possibility of getting to know such wonderful people, such interesting people from all over the world, academics, non-academics, and to go on this journey with them, which is certainly not over. It is for me, as far as I'm concerned. I told the chairman that I would be willing to help occasionally if needed, but this is on the side. But I can no longer devote my time permanently to this organization, but I leave it with a great sense of pleasure and especially of gratitude. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you very much, Nick. Beautiful.
Thank you. I mean,
Chairman David Devlin announced when he opened the evening, we have two parts to the evening. One was honouring Lyon. The second part is that we have a dinner speaker, and it is my pleasure to introduce David Frick, who is a member of the executive board of Nestlé SA. Nestlé is, of course, just down the road from here in Vevey, and he's responsible for corporate governance on the board. Now, David has been with Nestlé for some years. He was with Credit Suisse before, and he was called in to really transform the governance of Nestlé. And if you have any doubts of this, I had the pleasure of visiting the offices of Nestlé, and when you walk into reception, you find the 150-year celebration book of Nestlé, and you open page 145, and you find a chapter on corporate governance, which is, of course, fantastic that our subject made it into the 150-year book of a company, and you read about the transformation that had to be done, overcoming double quota requirements, and then you read about the man who managed to do it, David Frick. Now, he is going to speak to us not about that episode tonight, but he's going to speak about the future challenge, or the challenge that companies like Nestlé face today, which is that the world is looking to the E and the S and the G when they talk about corporate governance. And the topic he's chosen for tonight's speech is, or tonight's thoughts he's going to share with us, is public corporations under attack, ? The floor is yours, David. We're looking forward to your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, indeed, I preparing for this evening, I was thinking, should I give a big speech about how great corporate governance is, and decided not to. One of the reasons is that, one of the advice I always received from Peter Brabeck, our former chairman, that he said it becomes dangerous when you start believing it yourself. So that's why tonight I actually want to look a little bit from the other end, and one of the things which I thought was quite intriguing recently is when I heard that in the last 10 years only, public corporations' contribution to world GDP has actually declined from 60 to 40%. So there is really a question mark, is the public company model per se under attack? And there is some evidence. Countless companies have delisted from the world's stock exchanges, as you know. Many new tech companies actually delay their offering or their IPOs as long as they can. Uber is an example. But also in European exchanges, there are many declines in IPOs. Those companies which do ultimately list make sure that their founders retain control, such as Facebook, or they give no voting rights to shareholders at all, like Snap. So apparently there are these fears of going public that one must ask, why is this the case, and what could potentially be done about it? So one reason for sure is the extensive regulation of public corporations. I take Switzerland as an example. The governance regulations here include now, after a popular vote, the binding vote on the compensation of the board and the executive board, the individual election of all board members for mandatory one-year terms, the direct election of the chairman of the board, the members of the board's compensation committees, and the independent shareholder representative. And this well-intended empowerment of shareholders has had unintended consequences. It shifted power from a mostly Swiss board, which has fiduciary obligations to the company and must ensure its long-term success, to a mostly foreign shareholder base, which has no fiduciary obligations at all and can be as short-term oriented as it wishes. Secondly, in many markets, we notice as Nestlé that the new competitors that enter do not have to comply with these extensive regulations. In many countries, our strongest competitor is no longer another publicly listed company like Unilever or Danone, but rather a local player who has found a niche to sell organic or artisanal products, for example. So some of our competitors are clearly driven by much more short-term strategies. They may be public corporations as well, but they have become dominated by an activist or dominant shareholder who favors short-term cost-cutting and profit-taking over sustainable long-term growth. And yet our shareholders are quick to compare the results of very different strategies across public companies with very different strategies and time horizons. So public corporations such as Nestlé find themselves in between local competitors who face much less regulation and sustainability expectations on the one hand, and competitors who are dominated by short-term strategies and ruthless cost-cutting on the other hand. Clearly, we have to find the right balance in between. And now there is, of course, no level playing field. According to a recent study by E&Y, investors do see long-term financial benefits in companies with high ESG ratings. So, for example, 40% of the investors said that a risk or history of poor governance would force them to rule out an investment, while 32% said they would do the same due to human rights risk from operations. So Nestlé takes its integrated reporting very seriously on both financial and non-financial performance. Our extensive Creating Shared Value report, written in accordance with the most comprehensive option of GRI 4, meaning it requires robust, rigorous verification, is carried out with Bureau Veritas and checked by the GRI. As you may imagine, this is a tremendous amount of work. Last year, over 600 data points had to be audited in the preparation of this report. Now, many non-public companies, like including our local competitors, do not have to comply with similar disclosures, nor are they pushed by investors or NGOs to the same level of commitment. So there is a certain double standard here. But what is perhaps even more troubling, when a public corporation does come into the focus of an activist approach, many long-term investors seem quickly willing to abandon their long-term agenda. Some may point to concerns about their own legal fiduciary obligations, but many probably are just following a healthy portion of self-interest. On this, there is some good news, however. According to a recent paper by Bob Eccles, which had surveyed a lot of institutional investors, the commonly cited barriers to ESG integration are not as great as commonly believed. Only a minority of investors are concerned that incorporating ESG factors can actually hurt financial performance, and only around 10% see the fiduciary duty of fund trustees as precluding ESG integration in the investment decision-making. 40% even see a trend of not doing so a violation of the fiduciary duty. So one would think that institutional investors who do put significant pressure on public corporations to pursue the long-term and sustainable success would be consistent and willing to support these corporations when they are following these commitments. So this brings me to a first request. Investors, NGOs and other stakeholders should be consistent in their approach. If they push public corporations to go far beyond the law in making commitments regarding sustainability, they should not just use the big companies to make their case. There should be a level playing field, at least when it comes to fundamental issues such as human rights or health and safety. But also when it comes to softer issues, such as environmental, social and governance concerns, it's simply not credible to apply this double standard. Second, if public corporations get under attack from activists, long-term institutional investors should think hard about the consequences when they take a position. They should not send mixed signals as to the importance of investing for long-term sustainable growth. Just imagine in the recent episode what the takeover by 3G would do to Unilever's sustainability agenda. Third, governments should be careful when they consider their position on such transactions. We are all for free markets and against protectionism, but there are serious questions if there is no level playing field, when state-funded companies are involved, or when acquisitions are funded largely by leveraging the balance sheet of the target and reducing its investments for future growth. Finally, there is a need for a cost-benefit analysis of all new regulation, especially those affecting public corporations. Fortunately, there seems to be a growing recognition of the dangers of over-regulation. In Switzerland, a draft corporate law proposal has been significantly cut back. A popular initiative which would make corporations directly liable for their worldwide subsidiaries and suppliers has been formally rejected by the government without any counter-proposal. Similar in the US, many regulations affecting public corporations are under review. The SEC has been mandated to provide additional relief for IPOs. And even in Europe, there is a growing awareness for the need for balanced regulation following the recent political developments. And organizations such as yours, the ECGI, whose political credibility probably far exceeds those of the private corporations, can play a very important role here. So let me conclude with these hopeful signs. Perhaps we have reached peak regulations for public companies. The G20 agenda seems mostly complete, and the primary goal in the US and in Europe is shifting from stability to growth. The public corporation, which undoubtedly has led to tremendous wealth creation in the past, must be allowed to fulfill its purpose. Where barriers are needed, they should be put in place. Where there are concerns about equality, these should be politically addressed. And where globalization has failed, perhaps we have a second chance in the digital revolution. But the law of public corporations itself should not be abused for such societal changes. Public corporations remain our best hope for reigniting growth, and long-term sustainable growth should be our common goal. Thank you.
People might have a few questions.
Is that the case? Please.
I'd like to ask a question, David. It's all very interesting. I'm just thinking that corporate responsibility, in some ways, I think is born out of globalization. So as companies have exploited globalization, they have been forced to think about the social consequences. But we are moving into an era where actually globalization is actually sort of under threat and receding. And if you look at America, we're going back to protecting steel industries, reopening coal mines, not worrying about the environment. And I just want to sort of ask you where you think that corporate responsibility is going to go in an age of protectionism, because in the end protectionism is going to be about survival, and you won't have time to think about corporate responsibility. Is that a real worry?
I think it certainly is a worry. I mean, I think that, of course, I think protectionism has many forms, right? And in a way, it has always been there. But I think that there is a risk in a way that globalization is being considered as having gone the wrong way. I think there is a chance that we could address some issues, like I said, in the digital revolution, in the digital world, that we could actually fix some of these issues and then, make globalization address these shortcomings that we obviously saw. But it's an intriguing question I don't know the answer to. Please.
So you're making a case for treating public companies not worse than private companies, right? Saying that what we have to do, they should be doing too. It's not obvious to me why that should be the case. You're public, they're not. So
Yeah.
you're different, so you're different.
No, that is true. Of course, it's not exactly equal. But I think where I see the double standard is when certain things are expected from us, and we are beat up by the investors, by the public on certain issues, and our competitors who may not be public corporations can do as they wish. And I think that is, to some extent, a little bit disingenuous, I would say.
I can resist following up. Aren't you overly sensitive?
We probably are a bit, but I think it is true. I mean, many NGOs actually, quite honestly, they tell us in the conversation, they know it's not fair. They tell us, they know it's not fair to attack Nestle, for example, for palm oil, because they know we are actually doing a very good job on this. But they tell us into the face, but we still attack you, because by attacking you, we can make the biggest difference. We can have the biggest, media exposure and so forth. And that I take a little bit an issue with, nevertheless.
I actually wonder whether you started with a bleak picture for the public, widely held and widely controlled public corporation. And I wonder whether the picture is not even bleaker. Because what we are seeing is that actually a lot of publicly traded companies now, some of them are state-owned, right? All the Chinese guys, etc. Some of them are actually controlled, right? So actually the widely held, widely controlled public corporation is becoming a rare animal and probably a better target.
Yeah, I fully agree. In that sense, I think the picture is even bleaker. And I mean, it's just, if it's true that in 10 years, the public corporations have, lost from 60 to 40% of GDP contribution, that is a startling figure. And you wonder where this goes from here. And just like you say, the Chinese, which we compete with, even more in a few years, a lot of these worries they don't have. They don't have to worry about all of this, all of these commitments that we have to make. So, yeah, Lisa.
Just a thought following on from all that. One of the things that's much discussed about millennials and the next generations coming along is that environmental, social, and governance ideas are kind of in their DNA. And that when they rise to run companies, whether it's public or private, and or become shareholders, that this will just be part and parcel of what's expected. Do you see any hints of that? Is there the possibility that we have a generational shift that changes the mindset about governance?
Well, I have to tell you, I recently I'm also responsible for compliance, and I came across a study, I think it was also by Ernst & Young, which actually concluded that millennials are worse than the older people in terms of anti-bribery prevention. So apparently 4 out of 10 millennials are willing to bribe if necessary, and only 1 out of 10 of the over 45-year-olds is willing to do that. So I'm not so sure about about the millennials knowing everything better. Please. But we also, of course, are trying to understand what the millennials want. We know these are our future consumers, just as a little counterpoint. Please.
I've been following a corporate governance issue for some months, which is quite well known, and that's involving Tesla's controversial acquisition of Solar City, the solar energy company. And there was huge corporate governance issues because of conflicts of interest, and Elon Musk was the chairman of both companies, was the largest shareholder in both companies. His two cousins founded Solar City. They did not necessarily take into account the interests of the minority shareholders. The deal went through. Today, the value of Tesla last month exceeded Ford Motor Company. Last week exceeded General Motors. It's the most valuable automobile industry on the planet. It's never made $1 profit. It's all borrowed money. And the corporate governance issues. How do we deal with superstars who seem to flaunt corporate governance, and the regulators, the stock exchange, they bless it and they pass it. And there's no kickback. I mean, there's no price to pay. And it seems like all the efforts that we're doing in diversity at boards and stakeholder treatment and reporting is cosmetic, because when it comes to real business, they ignore it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fundamental issue with governance. But of course, for every case like that, you have other cases where obviously, terrible corporate governance has led to terrible problems, right? So I wouldn't dismiss corporate governance per se, because in one or the other case, it doesn't. It's a very interesting question, yeah. And I mean, there is also, I think sometimes there is a time dimension, right? That things could work short term, they may get past, cut corners, but longer term it probably won't work. So that at least would be my hope. Marco.
Following your line, I want to be provocative a little bit. Do you think that large private companies, I'm thinking, about Cargill or Koch Industries, in today's environment, they have a competitive advantage?
Yeah, in the sense definitely that they don't have to comply with all the regulations and so forth. There is probably a little bit of that. Again, I would say long term it pays. I mean, what we do in the governance area, we do because we think it pays. We do think it's appreciated first by our employees. It helps us to find the employees that we want to work for this company. It helps us to attract investors that we want. And ultimately, I think it even helps us with the consumers. They don't want to buy products anymore from companies which are crooks. So I do fundamentally believe in the value of good governance. Yeah.
So maybe an uneven and not level playing field might be helpful for you. I mean, we have, of course, a counter movement, which is investors emphasizing more stewardship, like Standard Life Investments. So presumably these people overweight companies like yours. So that should mean that your cost of capital actually goes down relative to your competitors. I mean, is there the stewardship movement, has that arrived at Nestle? When you see that people overweight you because you're the best in class?
I mean, what we definitely notice is that, 5 years ago, if you spoke about good governance, it would be the specialty investors who care and who listen. And that has completely changed. Now it's really all the big institutional investors, they all care about governance, they all are building up their teams. So in that sense, I would definitely say that that has changed. But, it's, as I said in my speech, I think there is a certain phenomenon which then is strange, that then when there is a takeover proposal or an approach by an activist, they very quickly change sides. And I mean, there has been a study in Switzerland which showed that, in all these hostile situations, the moment an offer is on the table, the shareholder base completely changes. And it's all the long-term shareholders sell out when the stock price goes up. And at the end, it's the short-term investors, the hedge funds, which decide on the fate of the company. And that, for me, is hard to comprehend. Please.
The question in that context, what do you do as an organization to make sure that the long-term shareholders, when push comes to shove, side with you and are indeed loyal? To what extent do you go to talk to them, engage them?
I think, we do many things, but I think the one thing which we've always felt is the most important is to have a very clear strategy and communicate it well. So we even put in our articles of association that Nestle will pursue, the long-term shareholder value, long-term value creation. So I think being clear about what you get when you invest in Nestle is one of the things which helps. And then, of course, we have a great effort going on to regularly meet with all the big shareholders. We do that throughout the year in settings which we call chairman's roundtables, where the chairman and we meet usually around 20 investors at the time, and we do this in all over the world in 6-7 different locations, and we talk to them regularly about the strategy, about governance issues. So I think the hope is that by this they understand where we are coming from, and if they are ever contacted by a hedge fund, they will hopefully understand that Nestle is working on it, that the things which we do, or the hedge fund might tell them, they have already heard from us that we are working on it. So I think there are things you can do to prevent these types of situations. So.
Well, I think thank you very much.
Thank you.
David.
Oh my God.
Now, giving food to somebody from a food company is probably like carrying Al to Athens. But this is from Belgium. And I mean, this is not any takeover target suggestion idea, and it is a listed company, and it's very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.